The thunder of hooves echoed across the Montana prairie as blood streaked down Lyla Thornton's arm, her desperate flight from Whiteridge having lasted 3 days with barely a moment's rest. The year was 1875, and the young woman of 22 summers had never imagined she would find herself racing toward an uncertain future in a town whose name she knew only from a crumpled newspaper advertisement. Kearney, Nebraska, a place where no one would know her name or the shame she carried. "Just a little further," she whispered to the exhausted mare beneath her, the animal's coat slick with sweat despite the cool spring morning. "We'll find sanctuary there." The horse's labored breathing matched her own as they crested the final hill before the sprawling valley that cradled the frontier town. Lyla's hands trembled as she reached up to adjust the thick black veil that hung from her wide-brimmed hat, ensuring not an inch of her face was visible to the world. The last of her money was sewn into the hem of her dress, and the bundle strapped to her saddle contained everything else she owned: a spare dress, a hairbrush that had belonged to her mother, and a small Derringer pistol she had never fired. Kearney appeared first as a cluster of wooden buildings rising from the dusty plains, the Transcontinental Railroad cutting through its heart like an iron artery. The Union Pacific Station bustled with activity even from this distance, and Lyla felt a momentary surge of hope mingled with terror. Here, perhaps, she could disappear, become invisible behind her veil, and build some semblance of a life from the ashes of her former existence. As she guided her horse down the gentle slope toward town, Lyla replayed the events that had driven her from Whiteridge in her mind for the 100th time. The accusations, the fire, the faces of the townspeople who had once greeted her with kindness, transformed by suspicion and hate. Most of all, she remembered the sound of her father's final words before she fled. "Run, girl, and never let them see your face again." The main street of Kearney stretched before her as she approached, lined with false-fronted buildings and bustling with the activity of a growing railroad town. Cowboys mingled with businessmen, while women in calico dresses hurried on errands or stood gossiping in small groups. All stopped to stare as Lyla rode past, her black veiled figure an unusual sight even in a place accustomed to strangers. She could feel their eyes upon her, and for a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm her senses. They would know. Somehow they would see through the veil and know the truth. Her hands tightened on the reins until her knuckles showed white, but she forced herself to continue forward, her back straight as a ramrod despite her exhaustion. The Central Plains Hotel stood near the center of town, its weathered sign promising clean rooms for respectable ladies and gentlemen. Lyla drew her horse to a stop before the hitching post and slid from the saddle, her legs nearly buckling beneath her after days of hard riding. She steadied herself against the mare's warm flank, gathering her courage before approaching the entrance. "Need help with your bags, madam?" A young stable boy called, running forward. Lyla flinched at his approach, then forced herself to remain still. "Just this one," she replied, her voice raspy from disuse as she handed him the small bundle. "And please see that my horse is watered and fed. She's traveled far." The lobby of the hotel was mercifully empty save for a balding man behind the front desk, who peered at her over wire-rimmed spectacles. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of her veil, but his expression remained professionally neutral. "I require a room," Lyla said, placing several coins on the counter, "for at least a week." The man cleared his throat. "Of course, we have a suitable accommodation on the second floor east side, gets the morning sun." He pushed the register toward her. "If you'll just sign here, miss." Lyla hesitated, then dipped the pen in ink and wrote L. Thornton in a careful hand. "Is there work to be found in Kearney?" she asked as she completed the signature. "I don't intend to remain idle while I'm here." The clerk studied her veiled figure with undisguised curiosity. "Well, the milliner might need help. Mrs. Welch is getting on in years, or perhaps the schoolhouse, always short of teachers out here." He hesitated. "Though I should mention, madam, folks around here can be curious about newcomers who seem to be hiding something." I'm not hiding, Lyla replied sharply, then softened her tone. I merely value my privacy. A medical condition requires me to shield my face from view. It wasn't entirely a lie. Dr. Harrison back in Whiteridge had called it a condition, though one of the soul rather than the body. The poor girl suffers from an acute sensitivity, he had told her father after her mother's death. Keep her from excitement and strong emotion. The clerk nodded, though his expression remained doubtful. Room 7, top of the stairs and to your right, baths at the end of the hall. Lyla nodded her thanks and followed the stable boy, who had returned with her bundle, up the narrow staircase. The room was small but clean, with a brass bed, a washstand with a porcelain basin, and a window overlooking the bustling street below. She tipped the boy with one of her precious coins and closed the door firmly behind him, turning the key in the lock. Only then did she allow herself to sink onto the edge of the bed, her shoulders sagging with the weight of her journey. With trembling fingers, she lifted the veil and breathed deeply, the cool air a relief against her skin. The small mirror on the wall reflected a face too pale and thin, with dark circles beneath blue eyes that had once been called vivid, but now seemed haunted. Her auburn hair hung in tangled waves, escaping from the hasty braids she'd fashioned days earlier. "You're safe now," she whispered to her reflection, the words sounding hollow even to her own ears. But safer than she had been in Whiteridge, where whispers had turned to shouts, and shouts to accusations that threatened to consume her as surely as the flames had consumed the church. Lyla bathed as best she could with the water from the pitcher, changed into her clean dress, and rebraided her hair. She considered venturing out to find something to eat, but couldn't bear the thought of facing the curious stares again so soon. Instead, she curled on the bed, veil firmly in place, and fell into an exhausted sleep haunted by dreams of fire and pursuit. Morning brought the sounds of Kearney awakening wagon wheels on packed dirt, merchants calling their wares, the distant whistle of a train. Lyla rose stiffly, her body aching from days in the saddle. She adjusted her veil with practiced movements and steeled herself to face the day and the necessity of finding work before her meager funds were depleted. The dining room of the hotel offered a simple breakfast of biscuits, gravy, and strong coffee. Lyla chose a table in the corner, her back to the wall, and ignored the stares of the other diners as she awkwardly managed to eat small bites by lifting the edge of her veil just enough to slip food beneath. The coffee scalded her throat, but she welcomed the sensation, a reminder that she was still alive despite everything. "Pardon me, madam," a voice interrupted her thoughts. "Mr. Winters at the desk mentioned you might be looking for employment." Lyla looked up to see a woman in her 50s, dressed in a practical dark blue dress with a crisp white collar. Her gray streaked hair was pulled back in a severe bun, but her eyes were kind behind round spectacles. "I'm Margaret Phelps, headmistress of the Kearney school," the woman continued, gesturing to the empty chair across from Lyla. "May I join you?" Lyla nodded mutely, her heart racing at this unexpected approach. "We find ourselves short a teacher with the recent departure of Miss Collins, who left us rather suddenly to marry a cattle baron from Wyoming." Mrs. Phelps settled herself in the chair with a sigh. "Have you any experience with children, Miss Thornton?" "Lyla Thornton," she replied, finding her voice. "And yes, I taught reading and arithmetic in my previous situation." Mrs. Phelps nodded approvingly. "Excellent. We have 37 students ranging from 6 to 16 years of age. The pay is $25 per month, with room and board at the schoolhouse if you prefer, though many teachers choose to maintain separate lodgings." Lyla hesitated. The thought of standing before curious children in her veiled state made her stomach clench, but the alternative remaining in her hotel room until her money ran out was worse. "The children will ask about the veil," she said finally. Mrs. Phelps regarded her steadily. "Children are naturally curious, but they also adapt quickly to what adults present as normal. I would tell them it is a private matter and expect them to respect your privacy, as I do." She paused. "Whatever your reasons for the veil, Miss Thornton, they are your own. What I need is someone who can teach reading, writing, and figures to children who might otherwise grow up without those skills." Relief washed over Lyla. "Then I accept your offer, Mrs. Phelps. When would you like me to begin?" "Tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. The older woman smiled. "The schoolhouse is at the end of Elm Street, just past the Mercantile. You can't miss it." She rose to leave, then hesitated. "And Miss Thornton, Kearney is a young town full of people who came here to start anew. Whatever you're running from, and I don't need to know what it is, you're not the only one with a past." With that, she departed, leaving Lyla to wonder if her shame was so transparent that even a stranger could sense it through her veil. The remainder of the day passed in preparation. Lyla visited the Mercantile to purchase a slate, chalk, and a new copybook, conscious of the whispers that followed her progress through the store. The proprietor, a rotund man with mutton chop whiskers, stared openly at her veil but was polite enough in his dealings. As she was leaving, laden with her purchases, she nearly collided with a tall figure entering the store. "Beg pardon, madam," a deep voice said as strong hands steadied her by the shoulders. Lyla looked up and up further still into the face of a man, whose features seemed carved from the very plains themselves. Sun-bronzed skin stretched over high cheekbones, and eyes the color of a summer storm regarded her with surprise and something else she couldn't name. He wore the dust of the trail on his clothes and the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to the hardships of the frontier. "No harm done," she managed to reply, stepping back quickly from his touch. "You must be the newcomer folks are talking about," he said, removing his wide-brimmed hat to reveal hair the color of wheat in late summer. "The veiled lady who rode in yesterday looking half dead in the saddle." Lyla stiffened. "News travels fast in small towns." "That it does." He smiled, revealing a slight dimple in his right cheek. "Name's Ryder Emerson. I run cattle north of town." He extended a calloused hand. Lyla hesitated before briefly touching her gloved fingers to his. "Lyla Thornton. Pleased to meet you, Miss Thornton. You planning to stay long in Kearney?" "I've taken a position at the school," she replied, unsure why she was sharing even this much information with a stranger. Something in his direct gaze made dissembling seem pointless. Ryder nodded approvingly. "Good. Mrs. Phelps runs a tight ship, but those kids need all the learning they can get." He studied her veiled figure thoughtfully. "If you're in need of anything at all, my ranch is the Diamond E, about 5 miles north. Anyone can point you in the right direction." "That's very kind, Mr. Emerson, but I doubt I'll need to trouble you." He replaced his hat with a slight tip in her direction. "No trouble at all, madam, and out here neighbors look out for each other. That's just the way of things." As he moved past her into the store, Lyla felt an unexpected warmth in her chest at the simple kindness in his words. Neighbors. It had been so long since she'd felt part of any community that the concept seemed almost foreign now. That evening, as she prepared for her first day of teaching, Lyla found herself thinking of Ryder Emerson's storm-colored eyes and the quiet strength in his voice. It was a dangerous line of thought she had come to Kearney to disappear, not to form attachments that might lead to questions she couldn't answer. She touched the veil that hung from the bedpost, the black fabric a tangible reminder of why she must keep her distance from everyone, especially men like Ryder Emerson who looked at her as though they could see through her disguise to the shame beneath. Morning came with a brilliant sunrise that painted the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. Lyla dressed carefully in her best dress, a severe navy blue with a high collar that she had purchased in Whiteridge for church socials she would never attend again. The veil fell from her wide-brimmed hat in a dark cascade that effectively obscured her features without completely blocking her vision. The schoolhouse stood on the outskirts of town, a simple white clapboard building with a small bell tower. Children milled around the front steps, their chatter falling to whispers as Lyla approached. Mrs. Phelps emerged from the doorway and rang the brass bell, signaling the start of the school day. "Children, this is Miss Thornton, Mrs. Phelps announced as the students filed into the single classroom and took their seats at wooden desks arranged in rows. "She will be taking over for Miss Collins, and I expect you to show her the same respect you show me." 37 pairs of eyes fixed on Lyla with unabashed curiosity. A small hand shot up immediately. "Yes," Lyla acknowledged the tiny girl in the front row. "Why do you wear that thing on your face?" the child asked bluntly. A ripple of nervous giggles spread through the room, quickly silenced by Mrs. Phelps's stern look. Lyla had prepared for this question. "It's a private matter," she said calmly, "just as some of you might have private matters in your families that you don't discuss with strangers. Now, who can tell me what you were learning with Miss Collins before she left?" The transition wasn't entirely smooth, but by midday, Lyla had established a tentative rapport with most of the students. The younger children seemed to accept her veil as just another adult peculiarity, while the older ones maintained a respectful distance tempered by natural curiosity. As the days passed, Lyla settled into a routine. She rose early, prepared her lessons, taught until mid-afternoon, and then returned to her hotel room to correct assignments and prepare for the next day. Occasionally, she ventured out for supplies or a brief walk, always aware of the stares and whispers that followed her progress through town. It was during one such excursion, almost 2 weeks after her arrival in Kearney, that she encountered Ryder Emerson again. She was leaving the post office, having mailed a letter to the bank in Whiteridge requesting the transfer of her modest savings to the Kearney Farmers and Merchants Bank, when his voice called out from across the street, "Miss Thornton, hold up a moment." Lyla turned to see the rancher striding toward her, leading a magnificent black horse. He was dressed more formally than at their first meeting in a clean shirt and vest with a string tie at his throat. "Mr. Emerson," she acknowledged with a slight nod. "What brings you to town?" "Bank business," he replied, falling into step beside her. "And a chance to check on my new neighbor. How are you finding Kearney?" "It's different from what I'm accustomed to," Lyla admitted, choosing her words carefully. "The children at the school are bright if somewhat unruly." Ryder chuckled. "That would be the Pearson twins causing most of your trouble, I'd wager. Their father's my foreman good man, but those boys have been wild since they could walk." "You seem familiar with all the local families," Lyla observed. "Born and raised in these parts," he confirmed. "My father established the Diamond E before the railroad came through. We've watched Kearney grow from little more than a water stop to what you see now." He gestured to the bustling street around them. They had reached the hotel, and Lyla paused at the entrance. "It was nice seeing you again, Mr. Emerson. Ryder, please." He removed his hat, revealing hair that gleamed like gold in the afternoon sunlight. "And I was hoping you might join me for supper at the hotel dining room. Around 6, if that suits you." Lyla felt her pulse quicken beneath the high collar of her dress. "I don't think that would be appropriate, Mr. Emerson." His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes dimmed slightly. "Nothing inappropriate about two neighbors sharing a meal, Miss Thornton. But I understand if you'd prefer not to." The genuine disappointment in his voice tugged at something deep within her, a loneliness. She had grown so accustomed to that she barely recognized it anymore. Before she could reconsider, she heard herself say, "Perhaps another time when I'm more settled." The smile that transformed his face made her breath catch. "I'll hold you to that, Miss Thornton." He replaced his hat with a tip in her direction. "Good day to you." As he walked away, leading his horse, Lyla watched his retreating figure with a mixture of regret and relief. There was something about Ryder Emerson that unsettled her carefully maintained composure, a directness in his gaze that made her feel seen despite her veil. That night, sleep eluded her as she tossed in the narrow hotel bed, torn between the growing desire for human connection and the fear that had driven her to Kearney in the first place. The memory of flames rising against the night sky and accusatory voices calling her name haunted her dreams when she finally slept. The following week brought unexpected challenges. 3 of the youngest students fell ill with fever, causing concerned parents to keep their children home from school. By Wednesday, attendance had dwindled to less than half the usual number, and by Friday, Mrs. Phelps announced that school would be suspended for at least a week to prevent further spread of the illness. Dr. Mitchell believes it's nothing more serious than seasonal influenza, the headmistress assured Lyla, but we can't be too careful. The widow Jenkins's youngest nearly died of scarlet fever last winter. With her days suddenly empty, Lyla found herself at loose ends. She had moved from the hotel to a small room above the millinery shop, where Mrs. Welch, a chatty woman in her 60s, had offered her reduced rent in exchange for occasional help in the shop. The arrangement suited Lyla well. Mrs. Welch respected her privacy and seemed content to carry the conversation during their interactions. It was while helping in the shop on Saturday that Lyla overheard news that sent a chill through her veins. "Did you hear about that terrible business in Whiteridge?" Mrs. Peterson, the banker's wife, asked as Mrs. Welch fitted her for a new bonnet. "My cousin writes that they had a dreadful fire at their church. Some poor deranged girl was blamed for it, daughter of the choirmaster, I believe." Lyla's hands froze on the bolt of ribbon she was measuring. "Was anyone hurt?" Mrs. Welch asked, pins held between her lips as she adjusted the bonnet's brim. "The girl's father died trying to save the church organ," Mrs. Peterson replied with ghoulish relish. "They say she fled town afterward. Some are calling it murder, though my cousin says the fire was likely an accident and the girl simply the convenient scapegoat." "How awful," Mrs. Welch clucked sympathetically. "What's become of the girl? No one knows. There's talk of a reward for information leading to her whereabouts, though whether for justice or protection depends on who you ask." Mrs. Peterson lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "They say she was touched in the head, prone to fits of spiritual ecstasy that bordered on madness." Lyla stumbled backward, nearly upsetting a display of hat pins. Both women turned to look at her. "Are you unwell, Miss Thornton?" Mrs. Welch asked with concern. "You've gone quite pale, at least your hands have." She gestured to Lyla's white-knuckled grip on the counter. "Just a momentary dizziness," Lyla managed to reply. "If you'll excuse me, I think I need some air." She fled the shop, heedless of Mrs. Welch's concerned call, and hurried down the street with no destination in mind. Her sanctuary was compromised. It was only a matter of time before someone made the connection between the veiled schoolteacher in Kearney and the fugitive from Whiteridge. Lost in her panic, Lyla didn't notice the approaching rider until his voice cut through her thoughts. "Miss Thornton." "Whoa there, you look like you've seen a ghost." Ryder Emerson swung down from his saddle, concern etched on his features as he took in her trembling form. Without thinking, she grasped his arm, her fingers digging into the rough fabric of his coat. "I need to leave Kearney," she whispered urgently. "Today? Now?" Ryder glanced around at the busy street, then gently guided her into the shadow of the livery stable. "What's happened? Are you in some kind of trouble?" "I can't explain." Lyla's voice caught on a sob that she fought to suppress. "Please, I just need to know, is there a stage leaving town today?" "Not until Monday," he replied, studying her with those penetrating gray eyes. "But whatever's frightened you, running isn't always the answer. Sometimes it just follows you to the next town. You don't understand." She shook her head, the veil swaying with the movement. "I thought I would be safe here, but I was wrong." A decision seemed to form in Ryder's mind. "Come with me to the Diamond E," he said suddenly. "It's isolated enough that whatever or whoever you're running from won't find you easily. At least until you decide your next move." Lyla stared at him through the barrier of her veil, searching for any sign of deception in his expression and finding only genuine concern. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." "I know enough," he said simply. "I know you're kind to those children at the school, even the difficult ones. I know you're working 2 jobs to make your way, and I know what it's like to be running from something." He paused. Everyone deserves a chance to start over, Miss Thornton. The sincerity in his voice cracked something within her that had been frozen since the night she fled Whiteridge. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate for the lifeline he was offering. "We'll need to get your things," Ryder said, practical once more. "And I should let Mrs. Phelps know you'll be staying at the ranch for a few days. She's a friend, and she'll ask fewer questions that way." Within the hour, Lyla found herself riding beside Ryder on the northern trail out of Kearney, her few possessions packed in saddlebags, and her heart racing with equal measures of fear and desperate hope. The landscape opened around them as they left town behind rolling prairies stretching to the horizon, dotted with wildflowers that painted the grassland in splashes of yellow, purple, and white. "Beautiful country," Ryder commented as they rode. "Different from where you come from." Lyla hesitated, then decided that this small truth couldn't hurt. "Yes, Whiteridge was nestled in the mountains. More trees, less sky. Missouri," he guessed. "Further east," she replied vaguely. Ryder nodded, accepting her reluctance to provide details. "The Diamond E isn't grand like some of the big spreads further north, but it's good land with reliable water. My father chose well." "Is he still living?" Lyla asked, grateful for the shift in conversation. "No." A shadow crossed Ryder's face. "Lost both my parents to influenza 5 winters ago. My younger sister Amelia lives in St. Louis now with her husband. It's just me and about a dozen hands running the place." "I'm sorry about your parents," Lyla said softly. "I lost my mother when I was 16, my father." She stopped abruptly. "Recent?" Ryder asked gently. She nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in her throat. They rode in companionable silence for a time, the rhythm of the horses' hooves a soothing counterpoint to Lyla's racing thoughts. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, a cluster of buildings appeared in the distance, the Diamond E Ranch house, and outbuildings nestled against a gentle rise in the land. The main house was larger than Lyla had expected, a 2-story structure built of solid timber with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Corrals and barns surrounded it, and beyond them stretched fenced pastures where cattle grazed in the late afternoon light. "Home," Ryder said simply as they approached. A Mexican woman in her 50s emerged from the house as they rode into the yard, her face lighting with surprise at the sight of Lyla. "Señor Ryder, you bring company," she called, wiping her hands on her apron as she descended the porch steps. "Elena, this is Miss Thornton," Ryder introduced as he dismounted and moved to help Lyla from her saddle. "She'll be staying with us for a few days. Miss Thornton, this is Elena Vasquez, the closest thing to family I have left and the best cook in 3 counties." "Welcome to Diamond E, Miss Thornton," Elena said warmly, her dark eyes curious but kind as she took in Lyla's veiled appearance. "I prepare the blue room for you, yes, please," Ryder confirmed. "And perhaps some of your famous stew for supper. We've ridden a fair distance." As Elena bustled back into the house, Ryder led Lyla up the porch steps. "Elena and her husband Miguel have been with the ranch since before I was born," he explained. "Miguel oversees the hands and Elena runs the house. Nothing happens on the Diamond E without one of them knowing about it." The interior of the ranch house was surprisingly refined, with polished wooden floors, comfortable furniture, and shelves lined with books. Landscape paintings adorned the walls, and a large stone fireplace dominated the main sitting room. "My mother's influence," Ryder explained, noting Lyla's interest in the surroundings. "She was determined that just because we lived on the frontier didn't mean we had to live like savages, as she put it." "It's lovely," Lyla said sincerely. The house had a warmth that went beyond the physical. It felt like a home, something she had not experienced since her mother's death had cast a pall over the Thornton household in Whiteridge. Elena reappeared to show Lyla to the blue room, a comfortable chamber on the 2nd floor with a large window overlooking the prairie. A brass bed with a handmade quilt stood against one wall, and a washstand with a porcelain basin occupied another. A small writing desk beneath the window completed the furnishings. Bathroom at end of hall, Elena explained. I bring hot water for washing. Dinner in 1 hour, yes. Left alone, Lyla sank onto the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by the swiftness with which her circumstances had changed. That morning, she had been the mysterious veiled schoolteacher of Kearney. Now she was a guest in the home of a man she barely knew, fleeing rumors that threatened to expose her past. Yet despite the precariousness of her situation, Lyla felt safer than she had in months. There was something about Ryder Emerson that inspired trust, a steadiness that seemed as much a part of him as his storm-gray eyes or the slight dimple that appeared when he smiled. She washed and changed into her spare dress, a simple gray cotton that had seen better days but was at least clean. The veil remained in place, though she adjusted it to ensure it hung properly from her hat. A part of her wondered what would happen if she simply removed it, revealed her face to these people who had shown her nothing but kindness. But the memory of Whiteridge and the accusations hurled at her kept her hands from lifting the black fabric. Dinner was served in a dining room adorned with more of the landscape paintings Lyla had noticed earlier. Ryder rose as she entered, pulling out a chair for her with old-fashioned courtesy. "I hope you're comfortable," he said as they seated themselves at a table that could easily have accommodated 12. "It's been some time since the Diamond E entertained a lady. Very comfortable, thank you." Lyla adjusted her veil to allow her to eat without revealing her face, a skill she had perfected during her weeks in Kearney. "Your home is beautiful. It suits its purpose," Ryder replied modestly. "Though I admit most of my time is spent outdoors with the cattle rather than appreciating my mother's decorative touches." Elena served a hearty stew accompanied by fresh bread still warm from the oven. Despite her anxiety, Lyla found her appetite returning as the rich aroma of the food reached her through the veil. "How long have you been teaching?" Ryder asked as they ate, carefully keeping the conversation to neutral topics. "Formally, only since coming to Kearney," Lyla replied. "But I assisted with the Sunday school in my hometown for several years." "You have a way with children," he observed. "I've heard good things about your teaching from my foreman. His boys actually want to go to school now, which is something of a miracle." Lyla smiled behind her veil. "The Pearson twins are bright, they just need direction for all that energy." The conversation flowed easily as they ate, touching on books they had both read, the changing seasons on the prairie, and Ryder's plans for expanding his herd. Not once did he press her for details about her past or the reason for her veil, and Lyla found herself relaxing in his company. After dinner, they moved to the sitting room where a small fire warded off the spring evening's chill. Ryder poured a small measure of whiskey for himself and offered Lyla a choice of tea or sherry. "Tea, please," she requested, settling into a comfortable armchair near the fire. "Tomorrow I'll show you around the ranch," Ryder said as he handed her the delicate china cup. "Unless you'd prefer to rest after your ordeal today." "I'd like to see it," Lyla replied. The prospect of staying within 4 walls, alone with her thoughts, held little appeal. "I've never been on a working cattle ranch before." "It's not the most elegant operation," he warned with a smile, "but we manage to turn a profit most years. The railroad has made shipping cattle east much easier than the old days of the long drives to Kansas." As the evening progressed, Lyla found herself sharing small, safe fragments of her past, her love of poetry, memories of picking blackberries with her mother, the satisfaction of helping a child sound out their first word. Ryder proved to be an attentive listener, his quiet questions drawing her out without ever making her feel pressed to reveal more than she wished. When Lyla finally retired to the blue room, she felt a lightness that had been absent for longer than she could remember. The panic that had driven her from Kearney that morning had receded to a manageable concern. Here, on the Diamond E, she was anonymous, a veiled woman whose secrets remained her own. She slept deeply that night, lulled by the profound silence of the prairie and the sense of security provided by the solid walls of the ranch house. Morning brought a brilliant sunrise that flooded the blue room with golden light. Lyla rose and dressed, securing her veil in place before descending to the kitchen, where Alina was already preparing breakfast. "Buenos dias, Miss Thornton," the housekeeper greeted her cheerfully. "Senor Ryder is checking cattle with Miguel, but he say to tell you he returned for breakfast. Coffee." "Yes, please." Lyla accepted the steaming cup gratefully. "May I help with anything?" Alina's eyebrows rose in surprise, but she smiled and gestured to a bowl of eggs. "You can beat these for the biscuits, if you like." They worked companionably side by side, Alina chatting about the ranch and its routines while Lyla listened, grateful for the normalcy of the domestic task. By the time Ryder returned, sweeping his hat from his head as he entered the kitchen, a substantial breakfast awaited on the table. "Something smells wonderful," he declared, washing his hands at the sink before joining Lyla at the table. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I have in months," she admitted, surprising herself with the confession. Ryder's expression warmed. "Good. The Diamond E has that effect on people. My father always said it was the prairie air." After breakfast, true to his word, Ryder showed Lyla around the ranch. They visited the barns where new calves were kept with their mothers, the blacksmith's forge where a burly man named Peterson was shoeing a horse, and the bunkhouse where the hands lived. "Most of them are out with the herd today," Ryder explained as they walked, "but you'll meet them at supper." Sunday dinner is something of a tradition. Alina cooks enough to feed an army and everyone gathers in the main house. Lyla's step faltered. "Perhaps I should remain in my room for that. My presence might make your men uncomfortable." Ryder stopped, turning to face her directly. "Miss Thornton, Lyla, no one on the Diamond E will question your veil. They might be curious, but they'll follow my lead. And my lead is that your privacy deserves respect." The use of her given name sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. "Thank you, Ryder. You've shown me more kindness than I deserve." "I doubt that." His gaze held hers through the barrier of her veil. "Whatever drove you to hide your face from the world, I can't imagine it justifies the burden you've placed on yourself." Before she could respond, a rider approached at a gallop, raising a cloud of dust behind him. As he drew closer, Lyla recognized the young stable boy from the Central Plains Hotel in Kearney. "Mr. Emerson," the boy called, reining his horse to a stop before them. "Got a message for you from Mrs. Phelps." Ryder accepted the folded note with a frown. "What's this about, Danny?" "Don't rightly know, sir. But there's strangers in town asking questions about a woman with a veil." The boy's curious gaze shifted to Lyla. "Mrs. Phelps said I was to deliver this directly to you and no one else." Ryder unfolded the note and read it quickly, his expression darkening. "Thank you, Danny. Tell Mrs. Phelps I received her message." He reached into his pocket and flipped the boy a coin. "And not a word about seeing Miss Thornton here, understand?" "Yes, sir." The boy caught the coin with a grin, wheeled his horse around, and galloped back toward town. "What is it?" Lyla asked, dread settling in her stomach like a stone. "Two men from Whiteridge arrived in Kearney last night," Ryder replied grimly. "They're asking about a young woman traveling alone who might be wearing a veil. Mrs. Phelps writes that they're claiming to be concerned for your welfare, but one of them has the look of a bounty hunter." Lyla's knees weakened, and Ryder's hand shot out to steady her. "They've found me," she whispered. "I have to leave now." "Wait." Ryder's voice was firm. "Running again just puts you back on the road with no protection. The Diamond E is 5 miles from town and no one but Mrs. Phelps knows you're here. Let me handle this." "You don't understand what I've done," Lyla protested, her voice breaking. "If they find me here, they'll implicate you as well. Then help me understand." Ryder's hands gripped her shoulders gently but firmly. "Tell me what happened in Whiteridge and we'll face it together." The moment stretched between them, taut with unspoken possibilities. In Ryder's steady gaze, Lyla saw something she had not encountered since her mother's death: unconditional acceptance. Whatever she revealed, he would not turn away in horror. "Not here," she said finally. "Inside." They returned to the house in silence, the bright promise of the morning now overshadowed by the threat from Kearney. In the sitting room, Lyla paced before the cold fireplace while Ryder waited patiently, giving her the space to find her words. "I was born and raised in Whiteridge," she began finally. "My father was the church choir master and organist. After my mother died, he changed, became stricter, more focused on religious observance. I was his only child, and he was determined that I would follow in his musical footsteps." She paused, the memories washing over her with painful clarity. "I did have some talent enough to assist him with the choir and play simple pieces during services, but my father saw something more in me. He believed I had been touched by divine grace, that my music could bring people closer to God." Ryder listened without interruption, his expression attentive but neutral. "There was a revival meeting this past winter," Lyla continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "A traveling preacher came through Whiteridge speaking of signs and wonders. My father was enraptured by his message. He arranged for me to play during the final service, convinced that through my music, the congregation would experience a spiritual awakening." Her hands trembled at the memory. "I was terrified. I'd never played before so many people." The church was packed that night, candles everywhere, because the revival preacher insisted that electric lights diminish the spiritual atmosphere. I began to play, and at first it went well, but then she stopped, struggling to continue. "What happened, Lyla?" Ryder prompted gently. "I fainted." The words tumbled out in a rush. "I'd been fasting at my father's insistence to purify my spirit," he said. "The heat from the candles, the pressure of all those eyes on me, I collapsed at the organ. My sleeve caught one of the candelabras as I fell, and it toppled into the draperies beside the altar." The horror of that night rose again before her eyes. The fire spread so quickly. People were screaming, rushing for the doors. My father, he tried to save the organ. It was an antique imported from Europe, the pride of the church. The smoke overcame him before he could reach the doors. Tears soaked the inside of her veil, but she forced herself to continue. "I was pulled from the building by the deacon's son. When I came to my senses outside, the church was engulfed in flames, and my father was nowhere to be seen. The revival preacher, he pointed at me, called me an instrument of the devil, said my pride and vanity had brought God's judgment on the congregation." "And they believed him," Ryder concluded quietly. Lyla nodded miserably. "Not everyone at first, but as the night wore on and they found my father's body, the mood changed. The preacher's words took root. By morning, half the town was convinced I had deliberately set the fire in some sort of satanic trance. So you ran." "The sheriff's wife helped me escape," Lyla admitted. "Her daughter and I had been friends since childhood. She gave me money and told me to head west, to change my name and never look back. She also gave me this veil, said if I covered my face, no one would connect me with the descriptions that would surely follow." "And that's why you've kept yourself hidden," Ryder said, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Not out of shame for what you did, but fear of being recognized." "Both," Lyla whispered. "I didn't start the fire deliberately, but if I hadn't been so determined to please my father, to be the vessel of divine grace he believed me to be, he would still be alive. The church would still be standing." Silence fell between them, broken only by the distant sounds of ranch activity filtering through the windows. Lyla waited, certain that now Ryder would see her as Whiteridge had a harbinger of destruction, a woman whose presence brought only tragedy. Instead, he rose and crossed to where she stood, his movements deliberate but gentle, like those he might use to approach a frightened horse. "Lyla," he said softly, "what happened in Whiteridge was a terrible accident, nothing more. You bear no more responsibility for that fire than the candles or the draperies that burned. But my father made his own choice to go back into a burning building," Ryder finished firmly. "A tragic choice, but his nonetheless. You didn't kill him, Lyla. And you don't deserve to live your life hidden away behind that veil out of misplaced guilt or fear." His words pierced the armor of shame she had wrapped around herself since fleeing Whiteridge. No one, not even the sheriff's wife who had helped her escape, had spoken so directly to the heart of her pain. "The men in town," she said, changing the subject abruptly, unable to bear the weight of his compassion. "What will we do about them?" Ryder accepted the deflection with a slight nod. "I'll ride into Kearney tomorrow, see what they're saying and who they're talking to. Mrs. Phelps can be trusted implicitly, and I doubt Mrs. Welch would knowingly put you in danger. The important thing is that you stay here out of sight until we know more. And if they discover I'm at the Diamond E, then I'll deal with them." The quiet certainty in his voice should have frightened her, but instead it offered a comfort Lyla hadn't known. She craved the assurance that she was no longer alone in her struggle. "Thank you," she said simply, the words inadequate for the depth of her gratitude. The remainder of the day passed in a curious mixture of tension and domestic tranquility. Lyla helped Alina prepare for the Sunday dinner, grateful for the distraction of practical tasks. By late afternoon, the hands began returning to the ranch, and Ryder introduced her to each of them with a casual explanation that she was a friend from Kearney staying at the ranch for a few days. If the men were curious about her veil, they hid it well, treating her with the awkward courtesy of men unaccustomed to female company. Miguel, Alina's husband, proved to be a dignified man in his 60s with a quick smile and respectful manner. The Peterson brothers, one the blacksmith she had met earlier, the other a wrangler, were massive men with gentle dispositions who reminded Lyla of friendly bears. The remaining hands were a mixture of ages and backgrounds, from young Tom Anderson, barely 18 and on his first job away from home, to grizzled old Jake Simmons, who had ridden with Ryder's father during the early days of the ranch. Dinner was a boisterous affair, with Alina's cooking drawing appreciative comments from all quarters. Lyla sat at Ryder's right hand, participating in the conversation when addressed, but otherwise content to observe the easy camaraderie among the men. They spoke of cattle prices, the condition of the range, and plans for the upcoming roundup with the comfortable familiarity of a family rather than employer and employees. As the meal concluded and the men began drifting back to the bunkhouse, Ryder touched Lyla's hand lightly. "Would you walk with me? There's something I'd like to show you." Curious, she followed him out onto the porch and down a narrow path that led away from the main buildings toward a gentle rise crowned with a single oak tree. As they crested the hill, the last rays of the setting sun painted the prairie in hues of gold and crimson. "My mother loved this spot," Ryder said as they stood beneath the spreading branches of the oak. "She said it was where heaven touched earth." He gestured to two simple wooden crosses nestled in the shade of the tree. "My parents are buried here." Lyla knelt beside the graves, noticing the fresh wildflowers placed at the base of each cross. "You still miss them very much." "Every day," he admitted. "But I've made my peace with their passing. It was quick a mercy in its way. One day they were here, the next." He shrugged, the gesture eloquent in its simplicity. "Life on the frontier doesn't allow for prolonged grieving. There are cattle to tend, decisions to make, people who depend on you." "Is that why you brought me here?" Lyla asked softly. "To show me that grief passes with time," Ryder shook his head. "I brought you here because this is the place I come when I need to remember what matters most. Not cattle or land or money, but connection to the people we love, to the land that sustains us, to whatever power created all of this." He swept his arm to encompass the vast prairies stretching to the horizon. "Your father made a terrible mistake in how he raised you, Lyla. He put his own spiritual ambitions above your well-being. But that doesn't mean you have to continue punishing yourself for his failures." His words struck her with the force of physical blows, stripping away the layers of self-deception she had built around her heart. She had blamed herself for the fire. Yes, but deeper than that was the guilt of failing to be the daughter her father had wanted, the vessel of divine grace he had tried to shape her into. "I don't know how to stop," she whispered, her voice breaking on the confession. Ryder knelt beside her, his presence solid and reassuring in the gathering dusk. You start by forgiving yourself, Lyla, and by allowing others to see you really see you without fear. The moment hung between them, pregnant with possibility. Slowly, hesitantly, Lyla raised her hands to the veil that had shielded her for so many weeks. Her fingers trembled as they found the pins that secured it to her hat. You don't have to do this now, Ryder said gently. Not until you're ready. If not now, then when? Lyla replied, gathering her courage. If not with you, then with whom? One by one, she removed the pins, letting them fall to the grass at her feet. With a final, decisive movement, she lifted the hat and veil together and set them aside, raising her face to meet Ryder's gaze directly for the first time. The last light of day caught in her auburn hair, illuminating strands of copper and gold among the darker tresses. Her eyes, a clear blue that reflected the evening sky, met his without flinching, though fear and vulnerability were evident in their depths. The face she revealed was neither beautiful nor plain by conventional standards, but it was honest, with a quiet strength in the set of her jaw and a sensitivity in the curve of her mouth that spoke of a soul capable of deep feeling. Ryder's expression softened as he looked at her, his eyes warm with an emotion Lyla dared not name. There you are, he said simply. Those 3 words so ordinary, yet spoken with such tender recognition, undid her completely. Tears spilled down cheeks that had been hidden for so long, and Lyla found herself enfolded in Ryder's embrace, her face pressed against the solid warmth of his chest as sobs racked her body. He held her through the storm of emotion, one hand gently stroking her hair, the other steady against her back. No words were spoken, none were needed in that moment of raw, unguarded connection. When at last her tears subsided, Lyla drew back slightly, suddenly self-conscious. I'm sorry, she began, but Ryder shook his head, cutting off her apology. Don't be, he said firmly, not for this, not ever for this. In the deepening twilight, with the first stars appearing overhead, and the gentle breeze carrying the scent of prairie grass, something shifted between them, a recognition of possibilities that neither had dared acknowledge before. Ryder's hand rose to cup her cheek, his thumb gently brushing away the last traces of her tears. Beautiful, he murmured, his gaze holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Before Lyla could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the moment. They turned to see Miguel riding toward them at a gallop, his expression urgent even in the failing light. Señor Ryder, he called as he drew his horse to a halt at the base of the hill. Riders coming, 3 men from town. Ryder was on his feet instantly, helping Lyla to hers. Did you recognize them? 2 strangers and the deputy, Miguel replied grimly. They are asking for you and for a woman they say might be hiding here. Lyla's hand flew to her bare face, panic surging through her veins. My veil, no. Ryder's voice was quiet but firm as he caught her hand. No more hiding, Lyla. Whatever comes, we face it together, openly. She stared at him, torn between the instinct for flight that had served her since Whiteridge and the newfound desire to stand her ground beside this man who saw her, truly saw her, and found no shame in what he beheld. Trust me, he said, his eyes never leaving hers. In that moment, with the prairie stretching endlessly around them and the stars emerging overhead, Lyla made her choice. She left the veil where it lay beneath the oak tree and placed her hand in Ryder's, drawing strength from his unwavering confidence. Together, she agreed, her voice steadier than she had expected. They descended the hill with Miguel following on horseback, reaching the main house just as 3 riders entered the yard. Elena stood on the porch, her expression worried as she watched their approach. The ranch hands had emerged from the bunkhouse, forming a loose semicircle behind Miguel, a silent show of support that brought a lump to Lyla's throat. Deputy Marshal Wilson was a tall, lean man with a drooping mustache, whom Lyla had seen occasionally during her weeks in Kearney. Beside him rode 2 strangers, one a heavy-set man in a rumpled suit who wore a badge on his vest, the other a familiar figure that made Lyla's heart skip painfully. Reverend Blackburn, the traveling preacher whose revival meeting had ended in fire and death. "Evening, Ryder," the deputy greeted, tipping his hat. "Sorry to disturb your Sunday, but these gentlemen are looking for a fugitive they believe might have sought shelter here." "No fugitives at the Diamond E, deputy," Ryder replied calmly, his hand still firmly clasping Lyla's. "Just Miss Thornton and myself enjoying the evening air." The heavy-set man leaned forward in his saddle, his small eyes fixing on Lyla with the intensity of a predator sighting prey. "That her, the Thornton girl from Whiteridge." "I am Lyla Thornton," she confirmed, her voice surprisingly steady despite the fear coursing through her. "Though I am no fugitive, sir." Reverend Blackburn pointed an accusing finger at her, his face contorted with righteous indignation. "There she is, the girl who brought God's judgment down upon our congregation, the one who murdered her own father through her prideful disregard for sacred things." "That's enough, Reverend," the heavy-set man said gruffly. "Miss Thornton, I'm Sheriff Barton from Whiteridge County. I'm here to escort you back to face questioning regarding the fire that destroyed First Baptist Church and resulted in the death of Horace Thornton." Lyla felt Ryder's hand tighten around hers, drawing her slightly closer to his side. "On what authority, Sheriff?" he asked, his tone deceptively casual. "Nebraska isn't in the habit of extraditing citizens without proper documentation." "I have sworn statements from witnesses," Barton replied, patting his breast pocket, "and a judge's order for her return to stand trial. May I see these documents?" Deputy Wilson asked, extending his hand. While the sheriff reluctantly produced the papers, Reverend Blackburn continued his tirade. "The Lord will not be mocked. This woman's soul is stained with the blood of her father and the desecration of God's house. She must be brought to justice." "Strange words from a man of God," Ryder observed coldly. "Where I come from, preachers speak of mercy and redemption, not persecution and vengeance." The Reverend's face flushed with anger. "You don't know what she did, what I saw with my own eyes." "She was in some kind of trance at that organ, playing music that sounded like it came straight from the pits of hell. When she collapsed, it was like the devil himself had been cast out of her, taking half the church with him." A murmur ran through the assembled ranch hands, but not the one Lyla feared. Instead of drawing back from her in horror, they moved closer, forming a protective half-circle around her and Ryder. "That's not what happened," Lyla said, finding her voice at last. "I fainted because I hadn't eaten in 2 days at my father's insistence, to purify my spirit. The candelabra fell when I collapsed, nothing more. It was a terrible accident, not a deliberate act." Deputy Wilson looked up from the papers he had been examining. "Sheriff, these statements all seem to be from the same handful of people, including Reverend Blackburn here, and this judge's order." He frowned. "It's not properly executed. Judge Henderson would need to review this before I could assist in any extradition." "We don't have time for legal niceties," Blackburn exploded. "Every day she remains free is an affront to divine justice." "Sounds to me like you're more concerned with covering your own responsibility in the matter, Reverend," Ryder observed. "Wasn't it you who insisted on candles instead of lamps? You who worked that congregation into a frenzy with talk of signs and wonders? You who first pointed the finger of blame when tragedy struck?" The preacher's face mottled with rage, but Sheriff Barton laid a restraining hand on his arm. "Easy, Reverend. This isn't helping our cause." Deputy Wilson handed the papers back to Sheriff Barton. "I'm sorry, but I can't act on these documents as they stand. You'll need to take them to Judge Henderson in the morning. In the meantime." He glanced at Lyla with something like sympathy in his eyes. "Miss Thornton isn't under arrest in Nebraska territory, and I've seen no evidence that she's committed any crime under our jurisdiction." "This is an outrage," Blackburn spluttered. "Sheriff, are you going to allow this obstruction of justice?" Barton sighed heavily, showing his true colors at last. "Look, I've ridden 300 miles because the town council insisted we bring the girl back for questioning. But between you and me, Reverend, I never did believe she set that fire on purpose." He turned to Lyla. "Your father was well respected, Miss Thornton. He had some strange ideas about religion toward the end, but he was a good man in his way. I'm sorry for your loss." The simple words of condolence, the first Lyla had received since her father's death, brought fresh tears to her eyes. "Thank you, Sheriff," she managed to reply. "We'll be staying at the hotel in Kearney tonight," Barton continued, addressing Deputy Wilson. "You can find us there if your judge wants to discuss the matter further." He tipped his hat to Lyla. "Good evening, Miss Thornton." "This isn't over," Blackburn declared as Sheriff Barton turned his horse. "The Lord's justice cannot be thwarted by legal technicalities." "Enough, Reverend," Barton said tiredly. "We've delivered our message. Now let's get back to town before it's fully dark." As the three riders departed, the tension that had held Lyla rigid began to dissipate. Her knees weakened and Ryder's arm slipped around her waist, supporting her as the ranch hands approached. "You all right, Miss Thornton?" Peterson the blacksmith asked, his massive frame looming protectively nearby. "I will be," she replied, touched by their concern. "Thank you all of you for standing with me." "Diamond E stands together," Miguel said simply, and murmurs of agreement rose from the other men. Alina approached, her dark eyes warm with compassion. "Come inside, Nina. You need hot tea and rest after such excitement." As the group dispersed, the hands returning to the bunkhouse, Miguel and Alina heading toward the main house. Ryder kept his arm around Lila's waist, his presence a solid anchor in the storm of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. "Are you truly all right?" he asked quietly when they were alone in the yard. Lyla looked up at him, at the genuine concern in his storm-gray eyes, and felt something unfurl within her, something that had been tightly wound since the night of the fire. "I think I will be," she said softly. "For the first time since Whiteridge, I actually believe that's possible." Ryder's smile was gentle. "Good. Because I meant what I said to the deputy. There are no fugitives at the Diamond E, only people who belong here." The simple declaration wrapped around Lila's heart like a warm blanket on a cold night. Belong. How long had it been since she truly belonged anywhere? Since her mother's death, perhaps, or even earlier, when her father's religious fervor began to overshadow the loving parent she had known as a child. "Thank you," she whispered, the words encompassing far more than gratitude for his intervention with the sheriff. Ryder seemed to understand the depth of meaning in those two simple words. His hand rose to cup her cheek, his touch gentle as a summer breeze. "You don't need to thank me for seeing what's right in front of me, Lyla Thornton." In the deepening dusk, with stars emerging overhead and the sounds of the prairie night surrounding them, Ryder bent slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw if she wished. But Lyla found herself rising to meet him, drawn by a force as inevitable as the turning of the earth beneath their feet. Their lips met in a kiss as gentle as it was profound, a promise exchanged without words, a recognition of something that had been building between them since their first meeting in the mercantile. When they finally parted, Lyla felt as though something fundamental had shifted within her, as if the world had rearranged itself around this new reality of being truly seen and accepted. "Come," Ryder said softly, taking her hand. "Alina will have that tea waiting, and tomorrow promises to be an interesting day." The kitchen was warm and fragrant with the scent of baking bread when they entered. Alina glanced up from the dough she was kneading, her eyes taking in their clasped hands and Lila's unveiled face with quiet approval. "Sit, sit," she urged, gesturing to the table where cups of steaming tea awaited. "You need warmth and comfort after such excitement." As they settled at the table, Miguel entered from the back porch, his weathered face grave. "The hands are keeping watch tonight," he informed Ryder. "2 men at a time in shifts, that preacher. He crossed himself. He has the look of a man who does not give up easily." "Thank you, Miguel," Ryder replied with a nod. I don't anticipate trouble, but it's best to be prepared. Lyla sipped her tea, the hot liquid soothing her throat. What happens tomorrow? She asked quietly. First, we speak with Judge Henderson, Ryder replied. He's a fair man, and once he hears your account of what happened, I believe he'll refuse extradition. Sheriff Barton seems reasonable enough. It's the Reverend who concerns me. Blackburn has been preaching his revival meetings across 3 states, Lyla explained. He's built quite a following with his dramatic style and promises of spiritual transformation. What happened in Whiteridge? It could damage his reputation if the truth were known. That he created the very conditions that led to the fire, Ryder's expression hardened. All the more reason to ensure your story is heard. The conversation continued as they finished their tea, making plans for the following day's trip to town. Despite the uncertainty that still hung over her future, Lyla felt a growing sense of peace. Whatever came next, she would face it openly, no longer hidden behind a veil of shame, but standing in the light of truth with Ryder beside her. Later, as she prepared for bed in the blue room, Lyla found herself drawn to the window. The prairie stretched beneath the starlit sky, vast and serene in the darkness. Somewhere out there, the hands of the Diamond E kept watch, protecting her as if she were already one of their own. The thought brought a warmth to her chest that had nothing to do with the tea she had consumed. A soft knock at her door roused her from her contemplation. She opened it to find Ryder standing in the hallway, a small bundle in his hands. "I thought you might want this," he said, offering her the bundle, her veil and hat, retrieved from beneath the oak tree. "Not to wear again," he added quickly, "but to keep, as a reminder of how far you've come." Lyla accepted the bundle, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. "Thank you for everything." "Sleep well, Lyla," he said softly. "Tomorrow is a new beginning." As the door closed behind him, Lyla returned to the window, the veil clutched in her hands. Slowly, deliberately, she opened the window and allowed the prairie breeze to catch the black fabric, fluttering it like a flag before releasing it to the night. The wind carried it away, a dark shadow against the starlit sky, until it disappeared into the darkness. A symbolic gesture, perhaps, but one that felt right, a tangible shedding of the shame that had driven her across half a continent. Whatever happened tomorrow, she would face it with her head held high and her face uncovered. Morning dawned clear and bright, the prairie awakening to a chorus of birdsong. Lyla dressed carefully in her gray dress, arranging her hair in a simple knot at the nape of her neck. Without the veil, she felt strangely exposed, but also lighter, as if a physical weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Breakfast was a quiet affair, with Ryder reviewing their plan for the day as they ate. "Judge Henderson usually holds court in the morning," he explained. "We'll ride in together and speak with him before the sheriff and Blackburn have a chance to present their case." "And if the judge rules against me?" Lyla asked, voicing the fear that had lurked at the edges of her mind through the night. "He won't," Ryder replied with quiet confidence. "But if the worst happens, we have options. I have friends in Wyoming, and Miguel's brother runs a trading post near the Canadian border. We would find a way." His matter-of-fact inclusion of himself in her future, regardless of the outcome, warmed Lyla's heart. This was no mere chivalrous gesture from a stranger. Ryder Emerson had planted his feet firmly beside hers and made her cause his own. They rode into Kearney shortly after dawn, the town just beginning to stir with early morning activity. The courthouse stood at the center of town, a dignified brick building with white columns flanking the entrance. As they approached, Lyla was surprised to see a small group gathered on the steps. Mrs. Phelps, Mrs. Welch, and several other women she recognized from her brief time teaching at the school. "Word travels fast in small towns," Ryder observed with a slight smile. "It appears you have more allies than you realized." Mrs. Phelps stepped forward as they dismounted, her practical face set in determined lines. "Miss Thornton, Mr. Emerson, we heard about the visitors from Whiteridge and their accusations. We're here to speak on your behalf if needed." Tears pricked at Lyla's eyes. "Thank you." I don't deserve such kindness." "Nonsense," Mrs. Welch interjected briskly. "Any fool can see you're no murderer or arsonist. Those children at the school positively bloomed under your care, even with that ridiculous veil hiding your face." She peered at Lyla approvingly. "Which, I might add, is a perfectly nice face. I never understood why you felt the need to conceal it." A laugh bubbled up from Lyla's chest, surprising her with its freedom. "Neither do I anymore." Judge Henderson proved to be a portly man with shrewd eyes and a reputation for careful deliberation. He listened to Lyla's account of the events in Whiteridge without interruption, his pen scratching across paper as he made occasional notes. When she finished, he removed his spectacles and polished them thoughtfully. "A tragic situation, Miss Thornton, but hardly a criminal one based on your testimony. Of course, I'll need to hear from Sheriff Barton as well, but I see no evidence of intent to commit arson or any other crime in your actions." Relief washed through Lyla, but it was short-lived. The door to the judge's chambers burst open to admit Reverend Blackburn, his face flushed with anger. "Judge Henderson, I demand to be heard before you make any decision regarding this woman." The judge's eyebrows rose at the interruption. "Reverend, I don't recall inviting you to this discussion. Where is Sheriff Barton?" "Still at the hotel," Blackburn replied impatiently. "But I am the primary witness to the events in Whiteridge, and I have evidence that proves Lyla Thornton's guilt." "Very well," the judge sighed, gesturing to a chair. "Present your evidence, Reverend, but I warn you accusations without substantiation will not be well received in my courtroom." Blackburn remained standing, drawing a folded paper from his coat pocket with dramatic flourish. "I have here a confession written in Lyla Thornton's own hand admitting her role in the destruction of First Baptist Church," Lyla gasped, her mind racing. "That's impossible." "I never wrote any such thing. Your father found it among your belongings after the fire," Blackburn insisted. "He gave it to me moments before he died, choking on the smoke of your making." Judge Henderson held out his hand. "The document, please, Reverend." Blackburn passed over the paper with a triumphant glance at Lyla. The judge unfolded it and read in silence, his expression giving nothing away. After what seemed an eternity, he looked up, his gaze moving between Lyla and the Reverend. "This is dated the day before the revival meeting," he observed. "It appears to be a letter addressed to Miss Thornton's father, expressing her fears about performing at the service and her belief that she lacks the spiritual qualities he attributes to her." "I see nothing resembling a confession to arson or any other crime." "It's there in black and white," Blackburn insisted. "I cannot be what you want me to be, Father. Something inside me resists the path you have chosen. What clearer admission of rebellion could there be?" "Expressing doubt about one's spiritual calling is hardly the same as confessing to arson, Reverend," the judge replied dryly. "In fact, this letter supports Miss Thornton's account that she was pressured to perform beyond her capabilities." Blackburn's face contorted with rage. "You're as blind as the rest of them. That girl brought destruction upon our church through her unholy influence. I saw it with my own eyes the way she played that organ. It wasn't natural." "What wasn't natural?" a new voice interjected from the doorway. "Was expecting a young woman to fast for days before performing at your revival meeting." Sheriff Barton entered the judge's chambers, removing his hat as he approached. "Morning, Your Honor. I see the Reverend has beaten me here." "Sheriff," the judge acknowledged with a nod. "You've arrived at an opportune moment. The Reverend was just presenting his evidence against Miss Thornton, which appears to be significantly less damning than he suggests." "That doesn't surprise me," Barton sighed, settling his substantial frame into a chair. "Judge, I've been sheriff in Whiteridge County for 15 years. Never knew Horace Thornton to be anything but a decent, law-abiding citizen until this revival business got hold of him. He changed, became obsessed with signs and wonders, and his daughter's supposed divine gift." He turned to Lyla, genuine regret in his eyes. "I should have stepped in sooner, Miss Thornton. Several people in town expressed concerns about your father's behavior, but I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere in religious matters. Blasphemy, Blackburn exploded. You would blame a godly man for seeking to nurture his daughter's spiritual gifts. I would blame any man, Barton replied evenly, who starved his child in the name of religion, and I would certainly question the influence of a traveling preacher who encouraged such behavior. Judge Henderson cleared his throat. Let's focus on the matter at hand. Sheriff Barton, in your professional opinion, was the fire at First Baptist Church the result of deliberate arson? No, sir, Barton replied without hesitation. My investigation concluded it was accidental, likely caused exactly as Miss Thornton described. The use of candles instead of safer electric lighting, the placement of flammable draperies near the altar, the general excitement of the revival meeting, it was a tragedy waiting to happen. Then, why did you pursue Miss Thornton across state lines? The judge asked, his tone curious rather than accusatory. Barton shifted uncomfortably. Politics, Your Honor. Reverend Blackburn has influential supporters in Whiteridge, including several town council members who insisted we bring the girl back for questioning. I hoped that with some distance and time, cooler heads would prevail. He glanced at Blackburn's flushed face. I see now that was optimistic. Judge Henderson nodded thoughtfully, then turned his attention to the papers before him. Based on the evidence presented and Sheriff Barton's professional assessment, I find no grounds for extradition. Miss Thornton is free to remain in Nebraska territory without fear of arrest or prosecution related to the events in Whiteridge. Relief flooded through Lyla with such force that she swayed slightly in her chair. Ryder's hand found hers, his strong fingers providing an anchor as the judge continued. As for you, Reverend Blackburn, I suggest you return to Whiteridge and focus on rebuilding your congregation's church rather than persecuting a young woman who has already suffered greatly. This matter is closed. Blackburn's face darkened with fury. This isn't over, he hissed, pointing a trembling finger at Lyla. The Lord's justice will find you no matter where you hide. That's enough, Reverend, Sheriff Barton said firmly, rising from his chair. Judge has made his ruling. Time for us to head back to Whiteridge. As Blackburn stormed from the chambers, the sheriff lingered, his expression apologetic. Miss Thornton, for what it's worth, I'm sorry for your loss. Your father wasn't himself toward the end, but he did love you in his way. Lyla nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Ryder squeezed her hand gently, lending her his strength. Thank you, Sheriff, she managed finally. Safe journey home. Outside the courthouse, the small group of women who had gathered earlier awaited the outcome with visible anxiety. When Lyla emerged, her face uncovered and her hand firmly clasped in Ryder's, a collective sigh of relief rose from them. The judge ruled in my favor, Lyla announced, still scarcely able to believe it herself. I'm free to remain in Nebraska, Mrs. Phelps stepped forward, her practical face softened with genuine emotion. Then I hope you'll consider returning to the school, Miss Thornton. The children have missed you terribly. Lyla hesitated, glancing at Ryder. The Diamond E is 5 miles from town, he said quietly. Not an impossible journey for a dedicated teacher. His meaning was clear in the warmth of his gaze. He was offering her a future that included both her newfound profession and a place at his side. The realization sent a wave of joy through Lyla that was almost painful in its intensity. I would be honored to continue teaching, she replied, addressing Mrs. Phelps but keeping her eyes on Ryder. Though I may need to adjust my living arrangements. Mrs. Welch huffed with amusement. Well, that was settled faster than I expected. When's the wedding to be then? Martha, Mrs. Phelps scolded, though her eyes twinkled with approval. Lyla felt heat rise to her cheeks, but Ryder's laugh was warm and unembarrassed. That's a conversation Miss Thornton and I haven't had yet, Mrs. Welch, though I admit it's one I'm looking forward to. The frankness of his response sent a thrill through Lyla that had nothing to do with embarrassment, and everything to do with the promise of a future she had never dared to imagine. As they mounted their horses for the ride back to the Diamond E, she felt lighter than she had in years, as if the weight of shame and fear she had carried since Whiteridge had finally been lifted from her shoulders. The prairie stretched before them, golden in the morning sunlight, as vast and full of possibility as the life that now awaited her. Ryder rode beside her, his profile strong against the blue expanse of sky, and Lyla knew with sudden clarity that her journey had brought her exactly where she was meant to be. "Race you to the creek," Ryder challenged with a grin, and before she could respond, he urged his horse forward. Lyla laughed a free, joyous sound that seemed to rise from the depths of her soul and sent her mare galloping after him. The wind caught her hair, loosening it from its careful arrangement until it streamed behind her like a banner of copper and gold. For the first time since the night of the fire, Lyla Thornton felt truly alive, truly herself, no longer hidden behind a veil of shame, but racing toward a future bright with promise, with the man who had seen through to her true self at her side. 3 months later, on a perfect autumn day when the prairie grasses had turned to gold and crimson beneath a sky of infinite blue, Lyla Thornton became Lyla Emerson in a simple ceremony beneath the oak tree on the hill. Mrs. Phelps and her students from the Kearney school joined the hands of the Diamond E and half the town to witness the union of the schoolteacher and the rancher who had lifted her veil and seen only grace. Elena had outdone herself with the wedding feast, and tables groaned beneath dishes that represented both her Mexican heritage and traditional American fare. The Pearson twins, scrubbed clean for the occasion and unusually subdued, presented Lyla with a handmade quilt that she recognized as the work of their mother and the other ranch wives. "For your new home, Miss Thorne, Mrs. Emerson," the older twin mumbled, his freckled face flushed with embarrassment. "It's beautiful," Lyla said sincerely, touching the careful stitching with appreciative fingers. "And you may still call me Miss Thornton at school if it's easier to remember." As the celebration continued into the evening, with fiddles providing music for dancing and lanterns casting a golden glow over the gathering, Ryder drew Lyla away from the festivities toward the quiet of the porch. "Happy?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist as they stood in the shadows. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied honestly, leaning into his embrace. "I came to Kearney believing I would spend the rest of my life in hiding, afraid of my own shadow, and now—" "And now," Ryder prompted, his voice warm against her ear. "Now I can't imagine hiding any part of myself again," Lyla said, turning in his arms to face him. "You gave me that gift, Ryder, the courage to step out from behind my veil and live in the light." "You always had that courage," he countered, brushing a strand of hair from her face with gentle fingers. "I just reminded you it was there." Their lips met in a kiss that held all the promise of the life they would build together, a life that would see its share of challenges and sorrows, but also joys beyond measure. For in lifting Lyla's veil, Ryder had not only revealed her face to the world, but had helped her rediscover the strength that had always dwelled within her, waiting for the moment when she would claim it as her own. And as the stars emerged above the Diamond E, two souls that had found each other against all odds celebrated not just their union, but the triumph of truth over shame, and love over fear, a testament to the healing power of being truly seen and wholly accepted, without condition or reserve. Years later, when their children asked about the day they met, Ryder would always begin the story the same way. "Her face was hidden behind a veil of shame, but when I lifted it, I saw only grace." And Lyla would smile, knowing that in those simple words lay the truth of their love story, a story of redemption, courage, and the transformative power of seeing beyond appearances to the heart that beats beneath.